the first one you list is fear of hell or eternal conscious torment.
Mhm.
How are some ways that you've seen that affect maybe clients that you've worked with, or
Mhm.
just in the study you've done? What are some ways that kind of shows itself in ways later on?
Yeah, so we see this a lot with people in extreme amounts of anxiety. There's a
Mhm.
term called religious scrupulosity, which really
Great
is
word.
a diagnosis. It is under the umbrella of OCD. And so we would consider it like a religious
Mhm.
OCD. So that is obsessions and compulsions with religious practices in order to be good or saved or make sure you're doing it the right way. We see this a lot with the eternal conscious torment and
Mhm.
hell piece, because of course that ultimately could, if we didn't do these things, we ultimately could, land in hell in most of these religions. And so there's a lot of focus on performance, making
Mhm.
sure to do things right, say things right, believe things the right way, follow all of the rules. And so that's where we get a lot of hypervigilance, a lot of anxiety, like I said, religious scrupulosity or religious OCD, and then a myriad of other mental health disorders, relational struggles, things like that, anything connected to trauma. But it can create a lot of disconnect in relationships as well, which can lead to
Yeah.
loneliness and isolation. It can become a great sense of fear and mistrust with other people, a lot of self doubt and lacking of self trust, because, okay, did I really like pray the prayer? Did I really do these things? I'm doubting myself,
Mhm.
a lot of shame and guilt that are going along with these things too. And so, from a clinical standpoint, that there might not be diagnoses for all of these things, but we can easily see, okay, so we have this belief that for many of us, we have never experienced a time where we haven't known this,
Yeah.
of like, hey, you're going to burn in eternal conscious torment without your family unless you do those things. And you're hearing it from a parent, somebody who is supposed to be loving you, protecting you, nurturing you, keeping you safe. And you have this parent or authority figure telling you, like,
Mhm.
here, this is what's going to happen to you. Oh, and I love you. And to then we start to conflate those things with one another. And of course, that's where we also start to see some of these adverse impacts throughout the remainder of our life in a lot of cases, because there's many people too that even coming out of religion, they are still grappling with that fear and
Mhm.
shame and doubt, inability to trust. And I know this sounds kind of funny, but it's very true and common, which is why I think it's important to bring up. We call it rapture anxiety.
Mhm.
And of course, many of us probably dealt with it while we were in religion. But this idea of like, I walk into my house and
Mhm.
nobody's there when they're supposed to be there, and like, oh shit, did the rapture happen? Right. And there's still so many people that I work with and talk with on a daily basis that say, oh, I left those beliefs behind. But that is the first thing that I think of when I don't hear back from this person, or when I walk into a place and these people aren't here, or it's a little too quiet, or anything like that. And so that's very real too. And we can chalk it up and be like, oh, that's kind of funny, but that comes from a real fear response.
Right. I love the Freudian slip where you said left those beliefs behind, a little left behind
Yeah.
insertion there.
Oh
But
yes, yeah.
I, yeah, all of what you're saying, again, it's one of those things where I'm fascinated by the effect of being taught from the time your like earliest memories are being for, like even things prior to memory, like when you're learning the sky is blue and don't touch that, and all of
Yeah.
those things you're learning as a kid. You're seeing pictures of Jesus, you're learning stories about heaven and hell and concepts that adults argue over and spend time racking their brains over, and you're
Yeah.
expected to kind of get it, and I
Yeah.
and you mentioned, yeah, it's kind of funny to look at, like, we've all seen the pranks in our religious upbringing where someone lays clothes out on the couch and convinces their friend that the rapture happened. But then you also hear the flip side of that story where people go like, oh, I broke down crying because I was terrified that really happened.
Mhm.
And that's one of the things that's really kind of helped me have empathy as I've listened to people in different religious environments,
Yeah.
is that no matter how bizarre the belief may seem, if it's real to you, it affects
Yes.
how you behave and the
Yeah.
decisions that you make.
Yeah.
And I think it's easy to go look at a Scientologist or someone
Right.
in a religion that we tend to think is out there.
Yeah.
But then we start reflecting on our own experiences and
Mhm.
going, well, we believed very strongly about this event happening that, we don't need to be worried about.
Yeah. And I think like, you briefly mentioned a few moments ago kind of this, there's different arguments to be made for like
Sure.
terminology and diagnosing, but I think the reason that I personally and professionally struggle with people saying things like, religion causes trauma or this belief is
Mhm.
trauma or things like that is because that like the trauma actually isn't held in the belief. It's in how your body, your nervous system responds to that. Because like you just said, we can look at somebody in Scientology and we're like, "Oh my gosh, how do you believe that? That's
Right.
laughable." Like it's not scary. But that's because we didn't grow up in it.
Yeah.
For them, that belief that they hold is the equivalent of like my belief in hell or the
Mhm.
belief in hell that I had. And so I think that's why for me it's really important to distinguish what trauma is, because like religion is not inherently traumatic. The belief of hell is not inherently traumatic, but it certainly can lead to trauma because of the way that that can live in our body and the inescapable nature of it, or who is really drilling that home to us, or what the consequences are. And I think that's important to recognize. If hell was inherently traumatic, then technically every person who's ever heard of hell should be traumatized, and we know that's not the case. So
Right.
I like to be careful with that.
Yeah. I'm curious too, like I mentioned just a second ago, like from the time you're a little kid, you're being
Yeah.
taught this. And I think most of
Mhm.
my listeners come from at least a young age. Like the majority I hear is my parents freaked out because they had kids and they put us in Christian school at 5, or they were born into the church. Like that
Mhm.
is a very typical
Yeah.
experience. Um, so I know for me, I'm at a spot now. I have no idea what I believe when it comes to religion at all. But I know for me, like the default operating system is informed heavily by religious upbringing.
Mhm.
And I'm envious of people I talk to who go, that doesn't make any sense. I can't even imagine thinking
Yeah.
in a default way that way.
Yeah.
But for me, when my mind wanders, it goes straight to
Mhm.
you're going to hell, you're
Yeah.
doing that. Like that
Mhm.
is my kind of subconscious way of thinking.
Yeah.
When I'm
Mhm.
objective and I'm thinking and my brain is functioning and I'm actively going in a certain direction, that stays off to the side. But how do you begin kind of rewiring that operating
Mhm.
system that has that buzz in the background all the time that's
Yeah.
telling you something that you were programmed to think is just as true as
Mhm.
the sky is blue, the grass
Right.
is green, so on
Yeah.
and so forth?
Yeah, well, it really is about rewiring. And I think what's
Mm.
really important to know, like if you look on social media, you hear all of these people saying, I had to unlearn this, I had to
Yeah,
unlearn that.
right.
And, call me crazy, but I'm going to get really technical. As it comes to neuroscience, we do not unlearn anything. When we have learned it, we have learned it. It doesn't just disappear from our memory. And I think that's important for people coming out of high control religion, because we can often shame ourselves for like, why do I still go to this thought? Why can't I stop thinking about this? Why, when I think about this, does my body have this reaction? And what I would say is because your brain and body are doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing. And so when we look at like how do we navigate this now that we've left a system like this, we really are looking at needing to have new lifestyles, beliefs, actions, relationships that we're intentionally putting into place and engaging with more than the old messages. Now I believe those are well-worn grooves. Like when we've been in it for 20, 30, 40 years, like
Right.
those are well-worn grooves in our brain, and our brain and body works together to create physiological signals and sends chemicals to all different parts of our body to have these very specific reactions. And so it's important to know that, because those will never go away, but they can be weakened. There's a saying that it's called Hebb's law. Neurons that fire together, wire together, which means the more you do something, the more likely it is that that thing will happen again and again and again. And so we would want to then, work with that belief or that action or that relationship or whatnot to do some reprogramming, not deprogramming, reprogramming of what we learned. And so that would be developing new habits. So it would be developing a sense of self-awareness, catching ourselves. There's some other like memory trips and ticks, what do they call them? Tricks and tips that you can employ to do that with music and hypnosis and things like that. But we really are looking at beginning to become aware of what's happening and trying, as soon as we become aware, to shift maybe our thoughts or actions, give ourselves a different internal physiological experience. And then the other piece of that is really offering ourselves a lot of compassion for when those old thoughts and habits pop up seemingly like unexpectedly. That's not a defect in who we are. It doesn't mean that we still are all about that thing. It just means that that is where our brain and body has been trained to go. And so, we just need to notice that and shift over into the new.
Yeah, love that. Before we move on from this topic, I know that there's many people, even on my own show, my audience is very diverse in terms of people that are religious, non-religious. I very much from when the last time I polled was like very close to 50-50 of people that hold to I'm religious or I'm not religious at all.
Yeah.
For the topic of hell specifically, it's a heated topic for lack of a better word. And there are people who believe in a literal hell, who believe that I love people, so I'm going to constantly warn them and talk to them about hell. And so it creates a really frustrating dynamic, I think, for someone who doesn't hold to that belief, who's constantly being hit with, you should believe it because, it's you're going there, so that's the conversation you're having. How should someone deal with maybe a friend, family member who is constantly waving that flag in front of them saying like, hey, watch out. And they're well-intentioned, because it's harder to tell those people like, hey, shut up and go away. Like, how do you kind of balance that out or encourage people to have those conversations?
Yeah. Well, I think so much of change happens through relationships. It doesn't necessarily happen through shaming other people, yelling at other people, telling them they're wrong, things like that. I think it's where we can lean into compassion and empathy. There was probably a time where we believed just as fervently in the messages that they were teaching, and we weren't telling other people about it because we wanted to control them, but it was because we so deeply believed them and wanted them to be in eternity with us or spend eternity.
We forget that all the time, that we used to have those beliefs. I think I'm glad you said that.
Yeah. And I found that when we can lean into that, I always say fundamentalism is a coping mechanism for a dysregulated nervous system, which I feel like is a very compassionate way to look at other people. So when we have these fundamentalist ways of thinking and relating, and now we're putting them on other people, all that is telling me is that that person is probably living in a lot of fear and hypervigilance, and they are trying so hard to just stay alive and survive according to their belief system. That gives me a lot of compassion, and it also kind of dissuades me from wanting to fight, right? So that's not to suggest that we just sit and listen all the time. Sometimes that is, we can do that, but there might be other times where we do need to set some conversational boundaries, such as saying like, hey, I understand this is something that's so important to you. I think it's actually best though if we don't talk about it. For our relationship, the way that we're going to be able to stay connected is if we kind of table certain topics and stay away from those and kind of focus on this other thing over here. Sometimes it could be kindness and listening and just letting them, talk about things without chastising them or challenging them. Other times, depending on the person or the location, you might ask if you could share your own experience or feedback or, education or whatever it might be. It's really going to depend on the relationship. But in my experience, when we offer empathy and compassion, there is a much greater likelihood of change and curiosity than when we fight back. And so that would just be kind of my suggestion, if at all possible. Now, I want to just one quick caveat on that is I know, especially when we are coming out of these systems, it can feel deeply triggering to be in the presence of somebody talking about something that you once believed and even caused a lot of pain in your life, and they're still championing it and telling you that you're wrong for not believing it.
Right.
And so in that case, it may be very appropriate to kind of redefine what that relationship is. Maybe that means stepping back for a little bit. Maybe it means like saying, hey, I will connect with you on the football game and that is it, or something like that, where we really do have to look at redefining that relationship for a little while so that you have time to develop things like internal safety and, resolve trauma, recover from things and whatnot, and then reconsider how to engage in that relationship.
Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah, I think relationships are everything. And I think also like expectation of conversation makes things easier. I shared an article like 3 days ago about, and then a couple months ago, I shared something kind of similar, but I've had a couple, ironically, like in the last few months, I've had people that have just randomly come up to me that are like witnessing for whatever religious denomination they're in. And my response to those conversations has been instantly like, oh, my palms are sweaty and I want to run out of here. And this is miserable. Same thing. I ran into a very popular conference speaker from when I grew up at the airport out of nowhere. And the minute I saw him, my hands were like shaking, and I was, I'm sitting in the terminal, like putting sriracha on like my breakfast burrito, like my hands like shaking everywhere. And it's like, it's funny because in those moments you're like, it feels so sudden and unexpected. You don't have time to prepare versus I think having a friendship or relationship where their intention, the context, and you're prepared for the conversation seems to make it a lot easier to put yourself in that mindset versus getting confronted, which I think is where most people find themselves is it's Thanksgiving dinner and they're turning to you. It's like,
well, and the other thing too is just because somebody asks a question does not mean you have to answer it. In these religious systems that we're coming out of, there is a lot of expectation that you can ask other people extremely private information and expect an answer, and that it's okay to challenge their answer if they don't give the one that you like. And so part of that is, again, we can offer empathy and compassion, right? Because there was a point where we probably did that too. And so that is a bit of rewiring to say, okay, this person said this or asked me for my thoughts or whatever. I can also gracefully decline. I can say, actually, I don't want to engage in that. Or we can find some other phrases to use to say no. Or we can just say no. Like, sorry, not interested in that conversation.
Yeah. I've mastered the art of when people ask me, because I've had a lot of strangers through the show, like when I'll post something about like an abuse case that happened and they'll go, let me ask, are you a believer? Which I talk about on the show, so they can easily find that. But a lot of times I just respond with, that's not relevant to what I posted. Like,
exactly.
It has nothing to do with this arrest that was just made. But anyway, we could talk about this. Each of these could be their own podcast episode.